themselves as ethical. Ethical is what? Not to tell any secrets. See, ethical is Adolf Hitler runs into your house and hides in the basement. You know he's there. So somebody comes and says, is Adolf here? I'm not that kind of a person. I'm not a tattletale. Got it? I mean, no, it's all a view of what ethics is. And one of the big issues was, who was the victor going to be? You have to understand, in 1940 and 41, and even the early part of 42, many people all over Europe thought the Germans were going to win. So if you think the Germans are going to win, the Nazis are going to win, you have to find some way of coping with it. So now I want to tell you what the Swiss did. There are two figures, by the way, who are very important in the history of Switzerland this time. One was the Minister of Justice, whose name was Heinrich Rothmund, and the other one was his assistant, the head of the police section, whose name was von Steiger. They were, by the way, very sympathetic to Adolf, and they did not like Jews. They were anti-Semitic, and they held positions of power. Their answer to the refugees was no. Out of the 250,000 or 300,000 who escaped, Switzerland, in the end, admitted only 9,150. I mean, given where it was and the number of people who showed up at its borders, most of them were turned away. And because these people had German passports and it was difficult for the Swiss to figure out who was Jewish, it was the Swiss who persuaded the German government to place on a German passport belonging to a Jew the big J, which stood for Jude, which stood for Jew. That was the result of Swiss intervention. Loans. There was no doubt about it. One of the ways to keep Hitler from invading was what? To give him money. So money was lent to him, large sums of money initially, which would support the war effort. And not only loans, technology was shipped from Switzerland. After all, the Swiss did business during the war. Technology was shipped from Switzerland, as it was from Sweden, to Germany, the justification being, so what would you do? Deposits were made. They were made by future Holocaust victims in desperation. But the most important deposits were made by Nazis. One of the reasons why the Nazis did not conquer Switzerland was they wanted the Cayman Islands. They wanted a place that was not under the surveillance of anybody, because even in the Nazi hierarchy, Goering didn't like Goebbels, and Goebbels didn't like this one, and nobody wanted to have their deposits, do you understand, under the surveillance of their enemies. Switzerland was this place where you could put your money, do you understand, and it would be safe. Nobody would say anything. So deposits. The German government looted the gold treasury of Belgium and Holland and brought it all to Swiss banks. They collected gold teeth from Holocaust victims, which were then melted down into gold ingots, and then they were brought to Swiss banks where they were deposited. And quite frankly, a Swiss bank, I mean, are you running a mafia operation in central Colombia? I don't know. And you show up in Bern, you get into the room, and they say, hello. And they say, we're very ethical around here. We don't tell anybody. And we promise you secrecy, and we keep our what? We keep our word. We are noble. We are noble people. We don't care where your money comes from, but what? If you put it in our bank, we won't tell anybody. Their response to neutrality, they kept claiming they were neutral. But very clearly from their behavior, and from the sympathies of many members of the Swiss government, they were not neutral, because it was very clear by the middle of 1943 that Hitler was going to lose the war, and in fact by the end of 1943 and early 1944 he did not have the military capability of invading Switzerland. But the Swiss government still continued to advance loans and to send technology, so no longer was the motivation simply the preservation of the neutrality. And last was the issue of propaganda, and the propaganda was very clear. It's the story I got, like the story of William Tell. There was this brave general who said, if they cross our frontiers, we'll retreat to the mountains and we'll fight to the last. If you look at the behavior of the Swiss, it was terrible. And the big question is, given the fact that it was so terrible, how after the war were they able to hide this performance? Why was it not revealed until 1996? If you want to find out, come back in 5 minutes.
Chemistry class led me to a life of crime. I catch murderers, rapists, and thieves with a microscope. Help your daughter become a scientist. Instead of a tea set, get her a chemistry set. Look at the boring job I got from being a science nerd. Expect the best from a girl. That's what you'll get.
At the end of World War II, Switzerland, unlike most of the countries of Europe, had no devastation. There was, by the way, a couple of errors in bombing on the part of Allied bombers, but on the whole, all of its cities were intact. During the war, although there were some food shortages, because after all they were surrounded by the war effort, there wasn't great discomfort, and in fact, money was made. So it was one of the most intact countries in Europe. Spared the devastation, because quite frankly, enough people in the Nazi government wanted a secret place to deposit their money. People said, well, they wanted a place where negotiations could take place in a neutral environment. They already had that. They had Portugal. And quite frankly, that was accessible to the British. The British weren't going to fly to Switzerland and in areas surrounded by the Nazis. So they served an important purpose, just like the Cayman Islands. A very, very important purpose, so important that the people with power did not choose to invade and left this country intact. Now, when the war was over, the Swiss presented themselves to the world. First, we're Swiss, not Germans. Very much like the Austrians. And two, we have a long history of resistance to conquerors. After all, we were the first to invent democracy. And I do want to point out to you again the distinction between majority rule and a free country. Sometimes authorities have to intervene with democratic mobs because they will what? Vote to kill somebody. We call that civil liberties. No, we call that our individual rights. And Switzerland did not have a long history of toleration. They had a long history of people assembling in fields and voting. What if everybody agrees and they all vote together? A repressive policy, which was certainly true. Most people don't make that distinction. There is nothing worse than the tyranny of the majority if there is no restraint on it. So, but they presented themselves. We never had counts, dukes, whatever. We kicked them out a long time ago with William Tell, the whole thing. Okay, fine. But there were lots of people who were very angry. There were people who knew the truth in some way, not the whole truth. Nobody could understand it because the truth was locked up in the secrecy of the banking system. People could suspect, but they could not know unless there was somebody who would whistle. All right. But there was confrontation. Already toward the end of the war, there were people in the American government, in particular, who were saying, we have to confront the Swiss. One of the issues, obviously, is the tremendous amount of German assets in Switzerland, which belonged to war criminals, or which belonged to the German government. Is that money to be returned or held by the people who put it there? One of the theories was Switzerland wasn't devastated. The world was. Maybe that money should be turned over to the Allies to be used as reparations. Do you understand? To rebuild cities, to do something with it. Should the war criminals be rewarded for their work? One of the big issues was that the Belgian and Dutch governments in particular were pressing for the return of their gold. It had been taken from them, looted from them, without their consent. Of course, the Swiss said, maybe with their consent. After all, Hitler created puppet governments. So the puppet government said, yes, although the puppet governments never officially said yes because their public would never have tolerated it. It was looted. There's a whole new book out called Nazi Gold. It's all about all this gold that was taken and placed in Swiss banks. One of the confrontations had to do with the accounts of Holocaust victims. What if in desperation or before desperation you had deposited money in a Swiss bank? Yes, the Swiss banks are committed to secrecy, but is it not their obligation to disclose these accounts? Because in most cases, the depositor is dead. He may have some survivors, in which case these survivors are entitled to it. Or if there are no survivors, certainly the people who should receive it are the people who were victimized by the Holocaust, not Swiss bankers. One of the tender areas had to do with collaboration. There were people in America and in England who were determined to identify the members of the Swiss government who were sympathetic to the Nazis and who had resisted every attempt to accommodate refugees. One of the things that was a major issue which provoked people into the confrontation was that it was very clear that transfers of money were taking place in 1945 and 1946 from Swiss banks. Many Nazis escaped to Argentina or to Spain. They wanted their money. They contacted the Swiss bank, and monies were being transferred from Swiss banks to support their escape. That was infuriating. I mean, it was after the war. See, what is the ethics of banking? Well, so you show up. You are Martin Bormann, Hitler's chief aide. And you say, hey, I made a deposit. Do you give him his money? I mean, you see, from their point of view, we are bankers. That's our role. And they made a deposit, and he's entitled to what? To withdraw his deposit. Did he kill 700,000 people on his way to making the deposit? We don't ask questions. If you ask questions, how can you do banking? If you gave every depositor a morals test, well, I mean, you know. One of the big issues, you see, which was very interesting, was after the war, certain countries were asking for money from Swiss banks. For instance, Poland, which had fallen under communist control and had experienced great devastation, and whose Jewish population had been completely destroyed, now claimed that the Jews who were killed had been Polish citizens. And therefore, the money deposited by Jews in Swiss banks from Poland should be turned over to the Polish government. I mean, you know, it couldn't get more what? It couldn't get more bizarre. It would be as though the German government were to ask for the deposits of German Jews who had either been exterminated or fled. I mean, so there you are. So if some people got mad, they were entitled. But they didn't know the whole story because nobody was on the inside who was making the accusation. What is very interesting about this banking system, I mean, look what they just did with Pat Robertson. They got somebody into that meeting, and did you read about it in the paper? They recorded what he said. It's terrible. They caught him saying things in private, which he should never have said, which will challenge the tax exemption of his organization, the Christian Coalition. Did you read that in the paper? Some of you may have read it in the morning. Well, I mean, so it's always dangerous. There's always somebody with there's always somebody with a tape recorder. No. I mean, recording what you have to say. But this banking association is terrific. Very few defectors, very few traitors. It's a very tight organization. So that was a good time to expose what really happened, but that isn't what happened. So I have to tell you why what happened. You see, Switzerland is very useful to everybody. All kinds of people I know who sit around denouncing Switzerland may have a secret account. Now, I mean, everybody has these places where they don't want anybody to find out where their money is. And this was before the Cayman Islands got it. No. In the end, for the United States, for England, for France, whatever these places, for the world of finance, for the world of people who want to avoid taxation, Switzerland was now important not for mercenaries. The Pope still got a few guards, by the way. It was famous for shelter, secrecy, put your money there. Too useful, right, to blow it up. And the second reason was very clear. Shortly after World War II, another war started. It's called the Cold War. The great enemy now emerged. It was called the what? The Soviet Union. It was Russia. And the United States basically stopped its whole denazification program. It was no longer interested in pursuing Nazis or punishing Nazi collaborators. It was interested now in rebuilding Germany. The part of Germany it owned. It's called West Germany and the whole thing. Therefore, the pursuit of Nazi criminals simply stopped. And in fact, many of these people presented themselves, quite rightly, as anti-communist. And so, the leader of our own rocket program in America, remember von Braun, was a very loyal employee. It didn't take very long. I mean, you shift. So the arrival of the Cold War and the continuing usefulness of Switzerland meant that the people who were offering their protest couldn't get very far. And so they encountered great frustration. What followed was an accord in 1946. The accord in 1946 basically said that the gold that had been deposited in Swiss banks was somewhere around $60 million. Multiply that by 10 in terms of trying to understand what its present value is. Okay, but $60 million. And the Swiss government would return that money. But it was very clear that it may have been up to $600 million, which would now be valued at what? $6 billion. But nobody was willing to challenge them. That was the compromise. How did you know what was there? It was all what? It was all secret. And whenever you said, well, we want to go in and check, they would say, are you prepared to be unethical? We have made a promise to our depositors that, indeed, nobody will look into it. Are you prepared to be unethical? The Swiss were very clever at that, they're always shifting. We, the bankers, we are good bankers. We keep our word. We take money from anybody, but once we take the money, we don't tell anybody, do we? So the Washington Accord was a scandal. Even one of the Swiss people who was involved in it felt bad about it. His name was Stutzky. And then in 1952, in terms of handling so-called victims' accounts and German assets, in the end, two Jewish organizations, one of which was the Joint Distribution Committee, which helps Jews in trouble around the world, received $1.4 million. I mean, it was like insulting. And not only that, the Swiss, to show how conscientious they were, sent money to Poland. Not to the families of the victims, but to a government of a country where the Jews had been exterminated. And the agreement was that the Swiss bankers would not disclose any information. One of the figures at that time was a man by the name of Max Etterle, and he said, no, we are a respectable bunch of bankers. We will not disclose. You can't come in here. You have to trust us. The reason why people put their money in our banks is we are what? Trustworthy, and we're telling you this, and you ought to believe it. Oh, well. And one of the reasons, what happened, of course, was, following World War II, the Jewish community itself was stunned. You know, the response of the Jewish community, basically, to find justice for the Holocaust didn't begin after World War II. Between 1945 and the Eichmann trial, things were very quiet. In fact, Jews were afraid of stirring up trouble. Swiss Jews in particular said, don't stir up any trouble because it will what? It will cause anti-Semitism. It wasn't until the early 1960s that a change occurred in the attitude even of the Jewish leadership. In fact, the popularizing of the Holocaust story had to wait almost 20 years before it suddenly emerged. It didn't happen immediately after World War II. Well, Switzerland is now let off the what? The hook. Token sums of money are now given, and now it presents itself as a neutral country, but obviously friendly to the West, and an ultimate example of successful capitalism. So now it's on the road, by the way, to recovery, 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 recovery. At the heart now of the Swiss economy is banking. And now people know it's for sure. Put your money in there, what? Not even Nazis get exposed. And now there's all this money to invest in Switzerland. That was one of the reasons why the Swiss government, which was always weak, never interfered with the banking industry, because the banking industry was good for the what? For the economy. So they would invest and put up a chemical plant, or they would go and put up a precision instrument thing, or whatever else it is. So why complain? So the chemical industry grows and the precision instrument industry grows. And then, as prosperity comes to the Western world, suddenly people discover that going to Belle Isle isn't so much fun. They want to go to Paris. They want to go to London. And one of the great tourist spots, because everything is so clean and the mountains are so high and it's so pretty, is Switzerland. You can go there in the summer and hike, you can go there in the winter and ski, and already by the 1950s, large numbers of people who were tripping over their feet were already learning how to what? Go down the mountains. So this place, boom, 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 boom. And tourists were wonderful because they weren't immigrants who wanted to stay. They simply wanted to come and what? Say wow and spend their money and then leave. The recovery, well, Switzerland now presented itself, because it was so pretty and because it was neutral, as the ideal country to hold an international conference. So every other day there was another what? It's another conference in Switzerland. One in Geneva, and one in Zurich, and one in Bern, and one in Basel, and the whole thing, they're all meeting there. Isn't that the place to meet? It's a nice neutral place. And the wealth is growing. The Swiss now develop one of the highest standards of living in the world. To go and visit Switzerland becomes increasingly more expensive. The last time I was in Geneva, I said, well, I also wash dishes in case the bill is too high. And the image, they now had all this money to invest in image. So they were through with cuckoo clocks and yodeling. That's gone. They're through with mercenaries. I don't think they've been advertising mercenaries for a while. But now it's this beautiful, clean, wonderful, fresh, do you understand, country without social turmoil, with safe streets. You got this image? Well, of course, they don't allow anybody in to live. No, it preserves, of course, its old purity, and there it is. It has problems. I mean, bread and chocolate is real. For people who came to work as waiters in Switzerland from Italy, it wasn't so nice. And people who didn't racially conform to the Swiss image of the desirable citizen did not have an easy time in Switzerland. They were quickly deported. They were much less generous than countries like Germany or France, where thousands and hundreds of thousands of guest workers, settled down. You could go to Germany, all these Turks. The French let in all the North Africans. I mean, nobody, very few in Switzerland. The second, and the Swiss were very annoyed by it. The last time I spent time in Switzerland, which was, I think, about 7 years ago, they were into the youth rebellion. It's inevitable. You get wealth. And then your children say, what's wealth? No. What's wealth? Does wealth bring you happiness? The whole thing. And the reason they have time to say it is because they have a lot of leisure time. So, and so now they're on the streets, and already in Zurich there was the problem. It was the problem that came from an affluent culture. And so now, with the secularization of Swiss society through capitalism, now new lifestyles are emerging, and the Swiss are now dealing with a world which is less predictable than they wanted it to be. But wealth does that. Wealth now provides leisure and opportunities for choice. So what are the realities? Because up until October of 1996, until D'Amato's accusation, came. This was the story of Switzerland. So let me give you some history of how it was revived. The World Jewish Congress was organized in the 1930s as a way of dealing on a world basis with the Nazi threat. Its great leader was a man by the name of Nachum Goldmann, and Goldmann wasn't really able to do very much. Following the war, the World Jewish Congress had fairly inept leadership. But in 1981, he got a real pizzazzy guy. He is one of the heirs to the Bronfman fortune in Montreal. I must confess I'm not crazy about Seagrams, but that's it's not an issue. But his name is Edgar Bronfman, and he became the president of the World Jewish Congress, and he decided to turn this organization into a vehicle that would be effective, and he was also interested in developing a dramatic image for himself. I never care about motivation so long as you do good, okay? And so Bronfman now is emerging as this dramatic person, and the first major thing he does is related to the Swiss issue, because the Austrians had also presented themselves as victims after the war. We're not German, we are victims, and so forth. And it was he who began the pursuit of Kurt Waldheim, the former Secretary General of the United Nations, and all of a sudden, all hell breaks loose, right? Waldheim becomes a persona non grata, and the whole image of the Austrian people is altered, and some of the things that happened during World War II are now exposed. And so he's on a roll, and he no sooner finishes with Waldheim, when now it's very clear if you're going to deal with Austria, which is an extension of Germany, you might as well deal with what? Switzerland. So now the question is revived. Already back in 1995, there were statements made by the World Jewish Congress, but it wasn't clearly heard until the American government was persuaded to do an investigation of Swiss behavior during World War II, and Senator D'Amato of New York, who quite frankly is responding to a large Jewish vote in that state. No doubt about it. Now stands up and says, guilty, confess, whatever. So for the past year, every other day in the newspaper, there's another article on Switzerland, which goes to show how effective it is. All right, so now let me look at some of the realities. One, was there deception on the part of the Swiss government? The answer is yes. Was there exploitation of monies looted from victims of the war? Was there exploitation of that money by the Swiss? Yes. Was there thievery? Yes. Because after the war, survivors of the Holocaust who came to Swiss banks to claim their money were told that the money would be turned over only if they could produce a death certificate. So that's exactly what they issued in Auschwitz. Just as you went into the chain, they had a death certificate. I mean, do you understand? Stealing. It's cruelty. Was there collaboration? Yes, there was collaboration. And was there criminal cooperation with Nazis trying to escape? The answer is yes. One of the realities of Switzerland was that historically, Switzerland was part of Germany. I mean, it's almost 70% German. It was part of Schwaben. The main language of Switzerland still remains 18% French, 12% Italian, but do you understand? Still remains German. Like Austria, it was part of the more extensive kingdom of Germany. One of the realities is, of course, the success of Jewish leadership. And I want to explain why. Well, first of all, there are lots of talented professional people, but one of the reasons is very clear. if the largest Jewish community in the world lived in Peru, nothing would happen. Got it? The largest Jewish community in the world, some 6 million strong, almost 1/2 of the Jewish people, lives in the United States of America and does have a lot of political power and political clout. And in fact, without that pressure, it would have been impossible even to initiate the action. One of the realities now is, by virtue of that pressure, is the hostility of the United States government to Switzerland. The Clinton administration has not been friendly. And in fact, that's scaring the Swiss a lot, because you don't want the United States of America to be your enemy, even if you are the original Cayman Islands. Okay, fine. What is clear is that only token compensation has been given. What has now happened is that the Swiss, in their fear, have suddenly found all these accounts that didn't exist before of Holocaust victims. And now they're proposing, first they started off to create a fund that would help victims of oppression. They had $70 million, and they keep adding sums of money that are token sums compared to the amounts of money that were taken and looted. One of the realities is that the Swiss public is now angry. That is, they're not angry at the bankers, they're angry at the world, which has destroyed the image of the Swiss people. And instead of saying to the bankers, why did you behave the way you did, they say it's a conspiracy. And in the middle of it all, Switzerland is experiencing an economic decline. The reason is very clear. It's part of Western Europe. The cost of labor is very high. If you're a Swiss corporation, you most likely can produce the same product, what? More cheaply elsewhere. And unemployment is now high in Switzerland. So now Switzerland is beginning to imitate Germany and France, and because it insists on being neutral, it won't join the European economic market, which means that ultimately some kind of tariff wall, will separate it from the rest of Europe, its natural market. It won't even join the United Nations. By the way, one of the things that infuriates me, I can't tell you how it infuriates me. You talk to the Swiss and you say you're peace-loving, you say you are in favor of peace and the unity of all peoples, and you've got one of the headquarters of the United Nations in your country in Geneva. Why won't you join? Well, we can't because we're neutral. I said, the United Nations is a neutral organization. Join it, pay your dues, and don't vote. Got it? Just pay your dues and what? Don't vote. You'll be neutral. Why wouldn't you support the United? No. We can't join any international organization. We're neutral. So meanwhile, the United Nations spends its money to put its buildings in Switzerland. So what are the implications? Right now, the Swiss are plenty scared. The economic decline and now the threat. In their mind, they see the United States of America under the control of Jewish finance. And they are afraid that they will be punished in some way. Two, there's a changed image. Switzerland may go back to yodeling and cuckoo clocks, but the image of Switzerland has changed, and it will not be altered. It won't go back to that old image. Three, in many respects, the story of Switzerland is tarnished in the same way as the story of Austria in terms of its collaboration and cooperation. And the last thing is very clear. I don't believe in the right of banks to shelter criminals. I don't regard that as ethical behavior. And therefore, there are certain secrets that cannot be secrets. And what I find is that people who can go that far suddenly stop because maybe they have an account somewhere. In the end, everything we do as human beings in a social world where we're entitled to be free and the masters of our lives is that whatever we choose to do has social consequences, and nobody can be sheltered from the implications of his or her criminal behavior. So if Adolf makes a deposit, we have a right to know. And whether the Swiss government will be prepared and the Swiss bankers to meet world public opinion by revising this, I don't know. The Cayman Islands certainly aren't, right? It's a big issue because all the people who say yes when it comes down to the line often say no because they are personally touched by that thing. So you think about how you feel. Thank you very, very much.